Welcome to the National Juneteenth Festival, Juneteenth the Truth Lecture Series with C.R. Gibbs. Our first lecture on June the 13th talked about the origins of Black enslavement. The second lecture was the U.S. enslavement from the 1500s to 1619. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the liberation movement of Black people from 1619 to the ratification of the 13th Amendment. I'd like to now introduce C.R. Gibbs.
All right. Hello, my name is C.R. Gibbs. Before we get started, I want to just share with you some of my book titles. One of them is Black, Copper, and Bright. This is the first book ever written on the Civil War regiment from the District of Columbia. Another one of my books is Black Inventors from Africa to America, subtitled 2 Million Years of Invention and Innovation. It focuses on such topics within its pages as inventions by Black women and the heritage of innovation and scientific advancement from the African continent. Another one is Black Explorers, 2300 BC to the present. This one, I think, is particularly unique because it does name names and provide dates on the independent exploration by African people of various places around the world. I'm also the co-author of this book, Black Georgetown Remembered, the first modern history of African Americans in Georgetown. And then finally, I'm also the author of a children's book entitled Friends of Frederick Douglass. This book is based on the 3 autobiographies by Frederick Douglass, as well as his writings and letters. It also introduces us to some of the people that he worked with, some of whom are well known, and others, such as Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett, that aren't as well known. Check it out. Okay, is that all right? As Gina's already talked to you, we're going to trace ultimately some of what we've done thus far, but we're also going to touch on the long and troubled road from 1619 to emancipation and the Civil War. But first, let's try and review some of what we've covered thus far. For example, we have discussed the issue of the first tendrils of European advancement and conquest in the new hemisphere. And so we see people like Francis Drake and Wande Onyate, Isubio Kino, who founded the earliest missions in Southern California. And the interesting thing about that is that a number of these early European explorers had African people with them, such as Esteban or Estevanico. Next slide. What we look at as well is that close behind these European explorers is they are bringing kidnapped, captured, enslaved Africans to do their work in their eternal search for glory and gold, for wealth, riches, and land. Next slide. As they move into the Caribbean, we'll see that it's not long before they establish crushing plantations, and these are the various parts. The Great House, the enslaved village, the fields, and the works. The works would be how you then convert the cut sugar cane into the liquid that will be taken on board vessels and sold all over the world. Next slide. Even here, if we're lucky enough, if we get a sense, we can see that a history that tends to leave us out, nevertheless does show some examples. For here, we have some of the earliest Africans who are pictorially rendered in the 15 and 1600s. And these are black men who have pieces of gold planted in their ears and nose, reminding us that this is in fact an old custom with some African people. But it is also a reminder that the transatlantic trade is a maw. It is a process by which more and more Africans are kidnapped and taken against their will across the ocean to generate a treasure chest of goods, not only simply hard metals, but also sugar. Also, we see a variety of other products that are going to be grown in one part of the world and taking to another part of the world. We believe that already by 1620, perhaps 500,000 captured and enslaved African men, women, and children had already been sold into chattel slavery by several European nations. The Spanish and the Portuguese colonies alone accounted for about 475,000. Next slide. So we have established that there are Africans in the Americas. I'm one of those who believes that it is likely, and there is evidence to suggest, that Africans not only came as unwilling immigrants, but also this land, this new land, saw African explorers as well. So when we say Africans were among the early explorers of the Americas, some of the Africans were servants, some were enslaved, some were free. We have at least one man of African descent that came with Columbus. They marched with Balboa across the Isthmus of Panama in 1513. They helped to build the first ships on the Pacific coast. And 6 years later, they dragged the heavy Spanish artillery that helped Cortez conquer the Aztecs. Black folks accompanied Pizarro in the conquest of Peru, and in 1565, blacks assisted in building St. Augustine. Blacks sailed up the St. Lawrence River with the French and helped to explore the Mississippi Valley. So we were full-fledged members of the opening up of this new land. Next slide. Let's go back for a second to one of the better known of the spoilers of this new land. And Columbus, wanted to find out what the Indians of Hispaniola had told him, that there had come to it from the south and southeast Negro people who bought those spear points made of a metal which they called guanine, of which he had sent to the king and queen for assaying, and which was found to have in 32 parts, 18 of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. This is from an account of the sailors who sailed with Columbus. It's called the Racolta, and it was quoted by Leo Wiener in his book, Africa and the Discovery of America. Next slide. You may not get it in your history books, but nevertheless, it still happened. And it is critical that you understand that whether than one voyage or half a dozen voyages, it was a series of failures by Europeans. They kept sending ships and people not coming back. It was seldom that there was a successful voyage. It's just that we don't know about the failures as much as we know about the handful of successes. Next slide. But ultimately, beginning in 1607, there will be the first permanent English settlement in what is now the United States. And this is a detail from the map drawn by one of the best known individuals in that process, Captain John Smith. It shows on the left-hand side here, King Powhatan, and he was the father of someone perhaps equally well known, and that would be Pocahontas. Now, the first thing you have to understand is that this confederation of a number of Native American groups, the leadership would not have been known to the leadership by the names that the Europeans gave them. Pocahontas' name was actually Matoaka, and Powhatan, so named by the Europeans, but his native name was Wahunsonaca. Wahunsonaca. And it will be here that I will park for just a moment and share something that I read to you, that I wrote, which was published just a few years ago. Who knew that such a momentous historical event could be chronicled in such mundane language? A Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's captain's name was Job. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. This is the sum of the earliest account of, next slide, the arrival of kidnapped, enslaved Africans into the colony of Virginia. Already by the time that these Africans are brought in 1619, Pocahontas has married John Rolfe. She is now the wife of a planter. They have a son, and she will soon pass. In fact, she's already passed away by the time of the arrival of these Africans. Next slide. 1607 is when it all began. Jamestown settled as England's first permanent colony in North America. Within its 3 walls, James Fort was easier for the small group of colonists to defend than a fort with 4 walls. What did the colonists have for defense? Answer, not much. The account, which is believed to have been written about the end of August 1619, is the only record of the arrival of the first Africans into the British colony over the mainland on North America. And they did not actually arrive at Jamestown initially. They went to Point Comfort, and then they were brought to Jamestown. They were in fact enslaved, kidnapped captives, stolen off a Spanish slave ship and bound for Veracruz in Mexico, and boarded by English pirates sailing into vessels. The Africans were traded for food by the hungry pirates when they reached Virginia. So it's, again, not quite what we were led to believe in our school books and by our early teachers. Let me give you an example. Many writers tried to clothe the colony's beginnings in gauzy myth. A 1907 Virginia guidebook waxed eloquent in lofty prose. Quote, "The Far East has its Mecca, Palestine its Jerusalem, France its Lourdes, and Italy its Loreto, but America's only shrines are her altars of patriotism, the first and most potent being Jamestown, the sire of Virginia, and Virginia, the mother of this great republic." But what we find as we look at this humble 3-sided fort was that Jamestown's founding never fit as neatly as the history books told us. In addition to slavery, Jamestown was also a place percolating with brutality, shocking cannibalism, lurking typhoid, dysentery, salt poisoning, and the vicious betrayal of local Native Americans. Pocahontas, an advocate for peace herself, was kidnapped by English colonists in 1613 and held for a year. Soon after her release, she married the tobacco planter, John Rolfe, who later recorded the arrival of the first Africans. Their son, also named Rolfe, and others journeyed to England, where she died. 3 years after the coming of the Africans, in 1622, the hard-pressed Native Americans launched a major rebellion and killed several of the Europeans and some blacks. Death had regularly stalked Jamestown streets. Half of the original colonists had already died within 4 months, along with 3/4 of the over 6,000 who would arrive between 1607 and 1624. We now know that the first Africans at Jamestown were not the first Africans in the Western Hemisphere. The triangular trade was already over a century old by 1619. And what we see is that the Spanish and the Portuguese had already begun importing enslaved black people into their colonies in Brazil and Uruguay. Even before Columbus died in 1506, Spain brought enslaved labor to North America before the English, and there is evidence that African explorers made landfall in the Americas even earlier. And as I said a moment ago in my book, Black Explorers 2300 BC to the present, I present several examples of the presence of independent African explorers in the New World. Next slide. And so here we have the famous or infamous Captain John Smith. There is a statue to him at Jamestown that you can go see. He's not a tall, strapping man that you've seen in the Hollywood epics or the children's cartoons. He was a short man. Next slide. But his mission was to guide the growth, cultivation, and shipment of tobacco. And so we have an idea that at Jamestown, casks of tobacco were rolled aboard a ship bound for England. That was all that mattered. And these early Europeans went so far toward that goal that they even planted tobacco in the streets of Jamestown. Next slide. From the book Africans in America, America's Journey Through Slavery by Charles Johnson, Patricia Smith, and the WGBH series research team, Jamestown had survived due to the growth of the tobacco crop. But despite the convincing spiel served up by those hoping to recruit servants, the colony was far from ideal. As was fairly standard in Europe at that time, the settlers were driven by an almost mindless focus on profit and a chilling casualness about how much suffering a human could endure. One man who stole 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal had a needle forced through his tongue and he was chained to a tree and left to starve and die publicly. Servants were mutilated, maimed, and sold like cattle. They were often put up as stakes in card games. They were murdered with impunity. The servants who did not die of disease perished because they were abused by people they worked for or killed by the Native Americans whose lands they threatened. Next slide. In 1619, the ship showed up and traded 20 and odd Negroes. They were trying to get food. The conditions on early Virginia tobacco plantations were extremely harsh. Field workers were housed in overcrowded shacks and barely given enough food to fuel their work. They had little chance to provide for themselves, for nothing was as important as the efficient production of tobacco. Everybody worked equally hard and were punished equally. Next slide. So in case you're not yet clear, this is the words that recorded the arrival of the first Africans into the first English colony by John Rolfe, who would later marry the woman we've been taught to call Pocahontas. Again, her native name was Matoaka. Matoaka. Rolfe wrote in August 1619, he brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. And remember, they did not land initially at Jamestown. They landed at Fort Comfort, Cape Comfort. Captain John Smith put some of this on the map that he created for England in the early 1600s. This is part of what you're looking at. Next slide. And this is an artist's depiction of enslaved Africans landing at Jamestown. I found it in the Harper's Monthly Magazine, January 1901. Next slide. These were dangerous times and what have some called poisonous partnerships. It shows that certainly beginning in 1622, if not earlier, there were conflicts between the Native Americans who saw their people, their culture, their land being taken over. Next slide. And in a way, that fort on the shores of a land so far away, Virginia, was almost the same as we see on the coasts of East Africa, where there were in several places similar walled or stockaded forts for European explorers and traders. Next slide. We don't know the names of the 20 and odd Africans that came ashore in 1619, but we have traces of their culture. Scholars are searching for a woman named Angela, one of the captured Angolans, to arrive on the Treasurer, a later ship that arrived in Virginia. She was listed as Angelo in the 1624 census, living in Lieutenant William Pierce's home in Jamestown, along with 3 white indentured servants. Although her name sounds masculine, she is listed as a woman and referred to as both Angelo and Angela. She was born in Angola around 1600, and her name was likely changed by her enslavers. In 2017, archaeologists at Jamestown began excavating her site and found a cowrie shell, which likely belonged to Angela. They believe it represented something important from her African homeland. We know that in West and Central Africa, cowrie shells were used as currency, adornment, and in religious practices. Why this particular part of Africa? We know that the captives on board the 2 vessels that had brought them to Jamestown were themselves captives of war. There had been a war in what is now Angola between the Mani-Congo, of the Kingdom of the Congo, and people called Ndongo. And the thing about it was that many of these people were already converted to Christianity. Next slide. More traces of the past. Clay pipes found in Virginia date to the 17th century and bear designs that reflect the influence of West African culture. Time and time again, not enough people have talked about the fact that the New World may have been Europeanized, but the New World was also being Africanized at the same time. Traces of the past. Archaeological sites throughout the African diaspora yield rich data that can reveal heritage and ancestry. Homemade pipes like the ones excavated at the Cliffs Plantation at Stratford Hall, dating to the 1650s, are valuable because of the insight they give scholars. The ones from Stratford Hall were handmade by the enslaved Africans who lived there, and the designs etched in the clay are specific to their cultures. Similar designs are found carved into objects throughout the Atlantic world. These clues help render a fuller interpretation of the early colonies and of the people who built the nation. These pipes may also hold the DNA of the people who used them. In 2019, scholars were able to collect DNA from a 19th century clay pipe found in Maryland and trace it back to Sierra Leone, most likely to the Mende people in West Africa. Next slide. By 1624, 2 of the 1619 arrivals, Anthony and Isabella, were parents of William, the first documented African American born in Virginia. Their son took the last name Tucker, as was commonplace from the people who had enslaved his parents. Many of their descendants remain in the Tidewater region of Virginia today. Some are buried in the family cemetery and cared for by the William Tucker 1624 Society. Next slide. The conditions on these ships as the trade grew ever larger and more disastrous were inhuman. Locked tightly, bound with iron fetters, below decks for days and weeks at a time. It is a miracle that and in such confinement, that you might find yourself, had you been on board one of these vessels, all day and all night, you'd hit a slap of the canvas sails. If you went below decks, the smell of the bodies, the vomit, the blood, the urine would create a, if you will, a cacophony of suffering. Being chained weeks at a time, you might be shackled to someone who is dead or dying. There is no way, next slide, to tell that whole story. And at the same time, the dehumanization proceeds from the kidnap and capture of these Africans all the way down to their intellectual degradation. I give you now the definition of Negro from the first American edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Negro, Homo peli nigra, a name given to a variety of the human species who are entirely black and are found in the torrid zone, especially in that part of Africa which lies within the tropics. In the complexion of Negroes, we meet with various shades, but they otherwise differ far from other men in all the features of their face. Round cheeks, high cheekbones, a forehead somewhat elevated, a short, broad, flat nose, thick lips, small ears, ugliness, and irregularity of shape characterize their external appearance. The Negro women have the loins greatly depressed and very large buttocks, which give the back the shape of a saddle. Vices, the most notorious, seem to be the poorest of this unhappy race. Idleness, treachery, revenge, cruelty, stealing, lying, impudence, profanity, debauchery, nastiness, and intemperance are said to have extinguished the principles of natural law and reproofs of conscience. They are strangers to every sentiment and of compassion and are an awful example of the corruption of man when left to himself. As we read this today, we would, most of us, I think, not want to be anywhere near a black person. But we must understand where this came out of. We must recognize, because we now understand that already before an Englishman had seen a black person, there were already inchoate images planted somewhere in his mind that associated the color of these unfortunate Africans with disease and filth and sex. So we now know that despite the years-long attempts to say, well, Europeans, particularly the English, didn't understand black folk, they met him at a bad time. They met him when we were enslaved. No, we now know that much of this, next slide, was baggage that they brought over the world with them. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption. So these babies, the sacred blessing of a black woman's womb, is turned into useful production. Next slide. But we did not come without laws, beliefs, and our own gods. We did not come here empty of the very feelings that make human beings a little bit higher than the animals. We had our own gods, as I said earlier. We had our own stories of creation. And as you look at this Yoruba creation myth, you may be able to recognize one or two things that might have you share something in common with other people from other places. That we believed in gods. We believed that there was an organized way that the world was created. Next slide. And we maintained our beliefs even through the years that we were brought here. This is a view of an extended skeleton on its back in situ. This is how it was found. Copper bracelets on each arm, okay, a pipe bowl on the pelvic area, possibly an obeah man or possibly a person who was skilled in traditional healing, a sangoma. Next slide. It is important to say that we had our own system of religious belief, a spiritual belief. Most African cultures believed in a supreme being or creator, God. We did not come here not believing in anything. Through the process of divination, people with specialized knowledge, known as diviners, interpret messages from the spirit world. They are consulted to determine the causes of misfortune, such as illness and infertility. Divination requires various types of ritual implements. Chokwe diviners, a particular ethnic group in Central Africa, for example, use divination baskets filled with a huge assortment of objects. Once the cause of a particular problem is known, diviners prescribe remedies. The commissioning of a sculpture in wood, clay, or metal is often the first step of the cure. An art object has power to represent ideas and make communications with spirits possible. Next slide. We had our own altars, erected to various deities, guardian spirits, and ancestors. Altars or shrines serve as points of contact between the physical and metaphysical worlds. They are intermediary spaces created in the belief that they will facilitate communication. Many altars are composed of ensembles of objects such as bells and figures and containers and offerings of food that give the altars their power. Next slide. But we also suffer from the ignorance of people not coming out of African cultures who attempt to relate what they're looking at when they have, at best, an impartial understanding of what it is they perceive. In the predominantly Muslim West African country of Mali, the Dogon and Babana people still practice traditional animist religions. Many of their secretive rituals have been abandoned in the past century, but a small sample of animal and human-like figurines dating from the early 20th and late 19th centuries, as well as another group from the 12th century and earlier, preserve a unique record of long-forgotten ceremonies. A team of researchers headed by Vincent Maisel, a material scientist at the University of Paris, Sud 11, has tested the black patina on the different idols for the presence of blood. Historical accounts, you see, from the early 20th century, particularly those by French anthropologist Marcel Grial, suggest that blood from animal sacrifice was part of the various Dogon rituals at the time. Maisel and his colleagues set out to corroborate the observations by testing for blood in both older and more recent models. The team used several of these cyclotron techniques, including micro X-ray fluorescence, where an X-ray beam causes a sample to emit light, which reveals its chemical composition. Studying minute examples of the patinas, they looked for the proteins found in blood. The team discovered that many of the recent Dogon idols were painted with blood, and the older ones coated in a mixture of mineral and organic compounds. Quote, "This proves that interpretations about these objects based on recent ethnological research must be used very carefully. Not everything that may have been dark red may have been human blood." Next slide. Rites of passage. And I'm glad to see that it is something that is being adopted more and more in the African American community. In cultures throughout the world, transitions in human life cycle, alter relationships and relative status. A woman gives birth, a child becomes an adult, or a family member dies. Such important transitions in African cultures are often marked by rites of passage. Many formal ceremonies make use of art objects. Birth and naming ceremonies, for example, may employ special regalia. Burials and commemorative ceremonies may require the presence of masks. Several rites of initiation often formalize the transitions from childhood to adulthood. A boy or girl may be removed from the protection of the family and sent to an initiation camp outside the village. The initiate returns later with a new social identity and superior status, and sometimes even a new or additional name. In some societies, initiation takes place in successive steps and continues throughout adult life. Among the Senufo of Cote d'Ivoire and Mali, for example, initiation follows a series of 7-year cycles. Next slide. But much of that would be forcibly stamped out as we were converted into units of production. Next slide. But no matter what they did, time and time again, they sought to control how we transmitted information, and they could not. I share with you an observation from Hugh Jones, the present state of Virginia, 1724. The Negroes are not only increased by fresh supplies from Africa and the West India Islands, but also are very prolific among themselves, and they that are born here talk good English and affect our language, habits, and customs. Remember, I mentioned earlier about the Africanization of the New World. Not only was there a Europeanization, but also one from the children of Africa. Next slide. Another example would be the borrowing of our language, our physical culture. And so we see them, enslaved Africans in the American South, playing the banjo, which comes to us from the motherland. Next slide. No less than Thomas Jefferson acknowledged the African origin of the banjo, and yet as it remains at once something tied to Africa, and yet people only take it so far back as Appalachia. African words filtered into the English or American speech. And so we have Mulambo, okay, Mulambo, which ought to perhaps stir from one's memory. Mulambo, which is a Bantu word for currency or money. In the neighborhood around the District, Maryland, and Virginia, we know that Mulambo has come down to us as moolah, and is quite a term for money. Imbanza, a Kimbundu word from Central Africa, which means a stringed instrument from which we get the banjo. Nguba, from the Bantu language, a certain seed, bean, or nut. Nguba. That comes to us as the name for a popular seed or nut, in this case a nut. This is where we get the word goober, for anybody that, if you thought the name came from the guy that hung out with Barney Fife in Mayberry, I hesitate to say no, that's not the way it rolled. Nguba, goobers, the African name for peanuts, or certainly an African word for peanuts. From the Wolof, in what is now Senegal and the Gambia, we have to be aware, to make one aware. Ipi, ipi. This has come down to us in modern language as hip or hep. From also the Wolof, dega, it means to understand. It means to understand. So we have the word in American speech that has come down to us as dig. In other words, do you dig? Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Another, based on another West African word, the Wolof, juki, which means to party or have a good time. Well, let's look at how that word has been Americanized, such as in, although this is before most of your times, there used to be a machine into which you put money, into which you then heard music. jukebox. Oftentimes you might go to a certain place of questionable reputation, where on Friday and Saturday night, there might be, I know Dr. Wright wouldn't know about this sort of place, but there might be some rooting and tooting and cutting and shooting. And that would be known as a juke joint. Juke joint. Now, we're not going to go through the whole list, but even today, on the football field, you certainly can still hear people say, man, he juked him out of his shoes. Okay, that is to say, he executed a dance move on the football field. So you get it. Just a couple more. We'll go down to Jev, from the Wolof language, Jev, which means to speak foolishly or misleadingly. It's foolishly or misleadingly. And that has come down to us as, anyone? I'll take guesses. Jive. This is where the word jive comes from. Second, from the bottom, another name for Egyptian hardwood or Egyptian blackwood. And the way the people wrote it in ancient Kemet, Hbny, we would pronounce it as ebony, ebony. Okay. And nini, from the Mindi. No, it doesn't mean anyone that's silly or stupid. But what it does mean is that oftentimes when the young ladies just given birth, trying to quiet their children, and the elder women would say in the village, girl, give that baby some nini. Give that baby some nini. Another word for breast. Next slide. Let us go on. But in the hellish environment of enslavement, all of these things were in danger of not being passed on when people are reduced to objects. But we fought back any way we could, and that is the idea. Next slide. And because of the slave trade, because the Americans still brought in unwilling captives. African people are the only involuntary immigrants to this country. That had a profound effect on our self-perception and our role in this country. So already from Jamestown, the first Africans arrived in Jamestown, 10 enslaved people listed in Jamestown's first census, 1638, Jamestown's first public auction of enslaved people. 1640, Emmanuel, a slave convicted of running away, is branded with an R, given 30 lashes, and forced to work in shackles for a year. And 1662, Virginia Assembly decrees that a child born of a slave mother is also enslaved. So we go from 20 and odd enslaved people arriving at Jamestown in 1619 to 4 million by 1860. Next slide. We should require reading of this document in our schools, not because of any references to the title, but because it is outright calumny. It is a staggering lie for people to associate independence and freedom with what is essentially a complaint list going from slave owners to the British Crown. Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Brother Rob. He has incited, as they say, this is a list of complaints from the colonists to the King of England. One of the worst things, transgressions. He has incited domestic insurrection amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. They do not tell our children that this kind of language is in the document. In fact, they talk more about the document than have students read it and understand the empty spaces and the contradictions that exist. In this particular passage, he has incited domestic insurrection amongst us. We'll come to that in just a moment. But to criticize and blame the King of England on the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, what do you think people are going to do when you arrive to kill them and take their land? Next slide. I mentioned that we would come to this, and now we have. The King of England, the colonists are blaming because a group of black men have been armed and are fighting the colonists. This domestic insurrection is best typified by what you're looking at now. This is the uniform and members of Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, enlisted by the British in Virginia. They're going to be the colonists' worst nightmare. Black men armed. Now, what do the black folk get out of it? They get their freedom out of it in another part of the empire. But when you look at what is written on the front of their clothing, we can imagine that Washington and Jefferson and Madison are having restless nights, knowing that perhaps lurking somewhere not too far away are brothers who announce their purpose proudly. Next slide. So when we track the enslavement process, we see that the key moments that led to the abolition of the long-standing transatlantic slave trade, we have the birth of abolitionists, we have colonial resistance. It is key, and we cannot stress enough that our ancestors fought back. This is not what the children are learned. They learn myths, political reform, and economic change. So all of these things are interacting upon one another. Next slide. Moving ultimately toward war, resistance, and rebellion on the vessels and on the land in the new hemisphere. Next slide. And so while we caught and killed some of them, we also ran away from many of them. We'll be sold on Saturday, the first day of February, 1823, at the jail of Washington County in the District of Columbia. For her jail fees and other expenses, a yellow woman by the name of Nancy. She is 4 feet 6.5 inches high, about 32 or 33 years of age, had on when committed an old straw bonnet, striped cotton and wool frock, coarse linen shift, and old shoes. Says that she was sold by Richard Winters of Charles County, Maryland, about 2 years ago to a trader by the name of Green, from whom she made her escape. Sale to commence 10 o'clock a.m. Terms of sale, cash. Next slide. This push and pull, the ebb and flow, the constant discord leads this nation to war, the American Civil War, in which black folk, again, paid the last full measure of devotion, perhaps as many thousands died. We know that there were some 120 or more regiments of men of African descent, as they were called, who put their lives on the altar of freedom. The freedom was not perfect. It would last 4 blood-soaked years, for which all too often black men and later black women would have to get the right to fight, but fought they did. If you visit this statue today at the African American Civil War Memorial, you will get a chance to see that we now know the names. We now know the scores and scores of regiments. We know that there were regiments of black soldiers that took part in the landings of a little place on the Texas shore called Galveston, June 19th, 1865. But they fought in the Mississippi Valley. They fought throughout the Deep South. They fought in Virginia. Whenever given the opportunity to strike a blow for freedom, the men of the U.S. colored troops did so with another 18 to 20,000 serving in the Union Navy as well, in ways large and small, recognized by history and forgotten by many. The sons and daughters of Africa and their descendants have played a major role in the continuing quest for freedom and justice and equality. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the National Juneteenth Festival, we would like to thank C.R. Gibbs for this amazing lecture from 1619 to the ramifications of the 13th Amendment. And we're looking forward to the next two lectures. The next one will be post-Civil War and the 13th Amendment. And then the one after that is, why do we celebrate Juneteenth, National Independence Day in the United States of America? So please stay tuned and check our website, www.nationaljuneteenthfestival.org. Thank you.